Hello, my name's Andy Critchlow. I'm Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and welcome to the Look Forward podcast from S&P Global. In today's rapidly shifting markets, success depends on anticipating what's next. The professionals who excel are those who can spot emerging trends before they fully materialize. The Look Forward podcast delivers exactly that. Insights to help you prepare for tomorrow's opportunities and challenges. We bring you expert perspectives on macroeconomic trends, capital markets, energy transition, and global trade, with a sharp focus on what these developments mean for the decisions that will shape your tomorrow. This podcast connects you with S&P Global's Look Forward Council, bringing cutting-edge research on long-term trends and transformative market shifts. Together, we're committed to providing the forward-looking intelligence you need to navigate uncertainty with confidence. Welcome to this episode of the Look Forward podcast. My name's Andy Critchlow. I'm Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights. And today we're going to be joined by Lindsey Hall, Global Head of Thought Leadership at Sustainable One, and also the host of the All Things Sustainable podcast, and Eklavya Gupte, Head of Carbon News Reporting and ET Coverage at Platts, part of S&P Global Commodity Insights, and host of the Energy Evolution podcast. I couldn't have thought of two better guests to join me on the Look Forward podcast to discuss the COP30 conference, the Davos of climate change and climate mitigation and all things energy transition, the IMF meetings of this, critically important sector for the world. How are we going to reduce carbon emissions? How are we going to reduce global warming? And how are we going to limit climate change? But this year it's in Brazil. Lindsey, you're there in Brazil. Is anyone else?
Yes, lots of people are here. So I'm actually here in Sao Paulo, and I'm here in Sao Paulo because right before COP kicks off, there are some events happening here. Mainly the private sector is showing up in a big way for something called PRI in person. That's the Principles for Responsible Investment, and they have their annual conference in Sao Paulo. Now, Sao Paulo is about 2,700 kilometers south of where the actual COP gathering is taking place. It's taking place in a town in the Amazon called Belém. And we can talk more about that, but it's a relatively small town. Really excited to join you here today, Andy.
Yeah, no, really great to have you on the show, especially to give us the insights on the ground. But I get, it's a serious question because obviously the convenience of where COP is located, having the actual main event, a long, long way away from where all the business is happening around Sao Paulo, that's obviously an issue. But I think that, there is a broader issue, a more serious issue around, the meaningfulness of COP and the COP process. And is that starting to drift? And I guess, I'm going to come to you, Eklavya, on this. And from your reporting, you've been to COPs. I believe you were at the event in Dubai. You've been to two, right? And the one in Glasgow. So how's that changed?
Yeah, and was in Baku last year as well.
Right, okay.
And, I guess one quick background. Last year, there were a lot of low expectations as well at COP29 in Baku. But we did see some big headlines, especially around a global climate finance framework. And we had a deal around Article 6. Now, obviously, in the last 12 months, the geopolitical and socio-economic landscape really politically has changed, has transformed itself.
Totally different, yeah.
But I do feel that from a multilateralism point of view, COP is extremely important from a global multilateralism point of view. But, to put my sort of journalistic hat on, we are probably expecting fewer big headlines this year compared to the last two. And there's one big reason for that. There are many reasons, I would say, but one big reason is actually this year at COP, at least in terms of the focus of COP30, is on implementation. So some of the big decisions have already been taken. It's been 10 years, for example, since the Paris Agreement. So now I think globally, all the countries, all the parties part of the Paris Agreement have a lot more it's a bit of a reality check for them, because they had these ambitions from Paris Agreement, and now it's like, oh, the world has changed. And as we're seeing even in Europe, even though the EU is obviously at the center of climate leadership, there's a big re-emphasis on industrial competitiveness and climate goals. Climate action is extremely important, but it needs to be balanced with the economic impact from that. So I think there's a little bit of a reality check that we're seeing, and what we're going to see probably in the coming days at COP30 is a little bit of a realignment of that.
That question around competitiveness, that's a big deal in developed economies. I know here in the UK, this is always an issue around some of the more aggressive energy transition policies. How can the British economy remain competitive, cheap energy, the cost of the transition, etc. Lindsey, what's your perspective on this implementation issue at COP? What are you expecting to come out of it in that space?
Right. Well, I think what I've been hearing broadly in sustainability conversations is this real focus on pragmatism. That's the word that's coming up a lot, and taking a real hard look at your business strategy and tying your sustainability strategy back to your financial decision making. So I think that's going to play out in these implementation type discussions. One thing, building on what Eklavya said, there is this focus on this concept of mutirão, which the Brazilian culture inherited from native indigenous peoples. And this refers to a community coming together to work on a shared task. And the COP30 president this year, he called on the international community to join Brazil in what he called a global mutirão against climate change. So I think that's largely symbolic, but I think it's really a beautiful idea. This idea that multilateralism, coming together as a global community, still has a role to play, even in this sort of fraught geopolitical landscape. And then yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It sounds very much like the common weal, but not everyone wants to turn that wheel, right? Wants to see it succeed.
Yes, and I think this idea that Eklavya was pointing to is really important. There's this broader tension that's playing out in many parts of the world, and that is going to be on display at COP30 between economic development on the one hand, and then sustainability and conservation on the other. And I think the challenge for the sustainability world is finding that sweet spot in the middle, that balancing act. This is a theme I've been hearing throughout the week here in Sao Paulo at PRI in person. This idea that climate and economic development, they don't have to be in competition, and that actually we need this reframing to recognize that they can, in fact, go hand in hand. One of the people I had a chance to speak to this week in Sao Paulo is the United Nations Development Program's Assistant Secretary General, Marcos Neto. And what's so interesting about Marcos is that in addition to the work that he does with countries all around the world on their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, he's also from Belém, the town that is hosting COP30. And so it was really interesting when I asked him, why are we hosting a COP in a place that is so small, that has relatively limited infrastructure? And also, what about the fact that, there have been some negative headlines about the fact that we've had to clear some forests and build roads and build up the infrastructure in this Amazonian town? Like, isn't that a bad thing? And he said, no, it's important that you recognize that there is room for growth. There's room for bringing people out of poverty while also continuing to work towards climate goals. So a balancing act, it's not easy to achieve, but I think that's going to be in focus at COP next week.
Because, previous COPs, obviously, they've had the controversy around the role of oil companies, fossil fuel producers. I mean, is there much presence there?
So obviously, I'm unfortunately not on the ground there. But from what we've heard, there'll probably be less presence of oil and gas companies at COP. Now, one of the reasons for that is also the fact that, the fossil fuels sector is obviously a little bit more empowered than it was, say, 2 years ago at COP28 in Dubai, despite the fact that it was taking place in UAE. But what's interesting is, and we've not seen this mentioned as much as it was mentioned the last two COPs. Brazil is a sizable oil producer.
Huge fossil fuel producer, yeah.
Brazil produced around 3.78 million barrels per day of crude oil.
Wants to be part of OPEC.
In June, yes, and it was its highest record high production. And I think it's definitely more than Azerbaijan produces, and I think even more than the UAE in recent years. So, we're talking at a big, sizable oil producer, but also, and we can talk about this a bit later, home to the Amazon forests. And forests is also one of the main sort of critical parts of this, of this COP. And that's why sort of Brazil has something called the Tropical Forest Forever Fund, which is central to discussions in Belém. But I think from an oil and gas industry perspective, yes, we are expecting less presence, but also there's maybe less eyes on them in the sense, a few years ago, obviously, there was this big, at COP28 in Dubai, there was pressure to include the words transition away from fossil fuels. As we know, despite a lot of intense negotiations, this was adopted. But this text was not adopted, or these lines were not included in the final text for Baku. And let's see what happens in Belém. But it looks like in the current political environment, it might be tough again to persuade some of the big fossil fuel producers to even have the conversations around the transition. And as we know, energy transition, energy addition, energy expansion, this is pretty much at the fore of our markets these days. So I do feel there's less emphasis. But one thing, again, quickly, is that Brazil, we see a lot of energy pledges being made during COP30. For example, in COP28, we had the big pledge, which was tripling renewables by 2030. One thing we are expecting to see, Brazil, which is the COP30 presidency, has already mentioned this, is they want to have a pledge for sustainable fuels. So sustainable aviation fuels, ethanol, as we know, Brazil is a major ethanol producer. So we will see a little bit more announcements on renewable energy related to biofuels. But yes, from a sort of purely fossil fuels, I think there will be some representation, but maybe not on the same levels that we saw in the last two COPs at least.
When you put it that way, you can kind of see the logic as well, because you can't really exclude, people, from this debate. That's going to be counterproductive. Ultimately, even when it was held in Glasgow, in the North Sea is still a major producer, of oil. Yes, Dubai was, controversial. Kazakhstan, but it's where are you going to put it ultimately at the end of the day? Carlos Pascual recently talked on your podcast, Lindsey, about carbon accounting and the push for product level transparency as key to unlocking Article 6. Eklavya, how is that narrative playing out in climate negotiations?
Yeah, so last year we obviously had, the big news out of Baku was actually the guidelines around Article 6, especially Article 6.4, which is basically a mechanism where countries, but also companies, can sort of trade carbon credits. And we saw these guidelines formulated. It took 10 years for the UN, for parties of the UN to finalize these guidelines. So that was big news. And now we're again in a stage where we're seeing a little bit more activity around Article 6. And I think there is less negotiations, but there's, again, comes back to the word earlier I mentioned, implementation. Carbon pricing, carbon markets is definitely going to be take center stage, not from a negotiation point of view, but maybe again, on the headlines. And one interesting thing is, with the EU pushing countries through CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which moves into its definitive phase from 2026, so from January 1st next year, we're seeing a lot of countries, and Brazil's a good example. Brazil will have its own emissions trading system, probably late 2026, early 2027, at least on a pilot phase. So this is where we're going to see a lot more, again, coalitions. So one of the focus areas for Brazil's presidency is to create a coalition of carbon markets. So definitely there's, carbon pricing is going to be integral. And again, Lindsey, it'd be good to hear your point of view and what you're hearing from some of your sort of sources and contacts while you're on the ground. Is that, are we going to see more emphasis on carbon pricing? Because there still is this narrative that if you put a price on carbon, it's an incentive for a company, a country to decarbonize.
I think anecdotally, yes. I actually just hosted a session at PRI in person this morning about the evolving landscape for reporting and regulations and standards. And there's a lot of, I think, interest in and hype around the role that carbon markets can play. So I think I'm optimistic about that. I think the other area where people are kind of holding their breath and watching when it comes to decarbonization is, of course, those NDCs, which I think, as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, Eklavya, this is 10 years on from the Paris Agreement. We're here in 2025. And this is the third time that countries are supposed to have updated their NDCs. And what we saw in September was that a lot of countries missed this deadline. We only have around 67, I think, that have submitted their NDCs. But what I'm hearing is that there's a total of like 121 that will have submitted them in the near future. And the ones that have come in are more ambitious and they are whole of economy. So I'm hearing this sort of mixed messaging about where we stand on NDCs as well.
Do you think that is the real sticking point for whether these COP negotiations will be a success or not? Is that the pivotal issue still? I mean, you mentioned Paris, and it's a long time back now, but we're still kind of stuck with this issue.
I think, mitigation and decarbonization are one important piece of the puzzle. I think adaptation is another huge focus heading into COP30, and Eklavya would be curious to hear your views on this as well. But the basic idea is we understand that we're not going to meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the 2050 goal. So what does that mean? That means we need to invest in adaptation because climate change is happening. It's leading to more frequent and severe extreme weather events. So we're seeing countries working to develop and implement their national adaptation plans alongside their NDCs.
I mean, that sounds. I mean, forgive me. Adaptation. It almost sounds like it's sort of admitting that we've given up. Yeah, we can't really stop global warming, so we're just going to have to live to learn to live with it, whatever the consequence. Is that right, or is that a bit too extreme of an interpretation?
I can see where you're coming from, and obviously, there's a little bit of reality in that. But I guess the way I would segue it is the fact that for this change to happen, we need the private sector. And one interesting thing that Lindsey mentioned, and even through some of my discussions, in fact, last week I hosted a roundtable for the V-Mean Business Coalition. And a lot of the questions were asked, will the private sector turn up? And well, they may not be in Belém, but they are definitely there. And as we can see with Lindsey, they're participating in a lot of discussions so they are central to this. Obviously, these national adaptation plans need to be put in by the countries, but we're talking about money here, finance. So I do feel that, and again, Lindsey, it'd be interesting to hear your point of view since I know you were in New York Climate Week. But one of the things we heard was that there was quite a bit of momentum. Not many people expected, some of that optimism, and it was a very busy Climate Week in New York. So if we see a similar one in Belém where there's that increased participation, and also sometimes what tends to happen in my few years of covering this market, when you see politicians take a step back from climate action, that doesn't mean that the private sector is always doing the same thing. And the carbon markets is a good example. The last 9 months for carbon markets has probably been, obviously the last 2 years have not been it's been a difficult time because of integrity concerns. Prices of carbon credits were very low. But I would say this year, since Donald Trump has taken over as US president in his second term, carbon markets are actually more resilient and stronger than they were 2 years ago. So I do feel that as we are seeing this political headwinds on the private sector, I don't think the picture is as sort of cynical or negative as it is maybe when you look at it from a sort of geopolitical standpoint.
Lindsey, what sort of role does finance still have to play in this adaptation process then?
Yes, well, I think Eklavya raised really good points, and private sector definitely needs to come to the table and I think wants to show up. Adaptation financing, the needs in developing countries are 12 to 14 times higher than the current flows. That's according to a new adaptation gap report that the UN Environment Program released last week. So there's this huge gap in financing, which won't surprise anyone who's been following this space. Emerging market and developing economy needs are really big. And a lot of these countries are also the ones that are going to be hit hardest by climate change. So definitely a big opportunity. And then a lot of the discussions that I'm hearing among the private sector are, okay, how do we address the perceived risk of investment in some of these markets? How do we make this attractive for private sector investors? So I think there's a lot of really creative thinking going into that question.
Yeah, it's a controversial subject. I mean, I interviewed Michael Liebrick, who founded Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and has been quite a thought leader in the space of hydrogen, but also an energy transition, but also a critic of hydrogen. In fact, a very vocal critic, primarily on the basis that much of it from a project perspective is uneconomic. I think that you look at ultimately finance looks at things through a profit and loss lens. And do you think is there still a discussion at COP with certainly with the various actors there around that for this adaptation to work, it needs to be more profitable for the private sector in some?
Well, I'm not sure how this discussion will play out at COP next week, but I can tell you what I'm hearing at Sao Paulo this week repeatedly is, again, this recognition that clean energy is often more affordable. And I heard someone make the point that we shouldn't be talking about renewable energy, we should be talking about cheap energy. And then I heard someone else make the point that efficiency gains and cost savings are not mutually exclusive with sustainability strategy and clean energy. So I'm hearing a lot of discussion about reframing the way that we talk about some of these topics.
Is there a leadership vacuum in this process? Is there a big previous for example, if you go all the way back to the mid or late 1990s and Tony Blair, who was UK Prime Minister at the time, he signed the UK up to some very aggressive emissions reductions policies, far more aggressive than other partners in the EU at the time. Was criticised for it, but he did show leadership, Tony Blair, regardless of your politics, was certainly one of Britain's most successful prime ministers, in the post-war era. So a kind of big political figure leading from the front on this issue. I don't see that anymore.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. What's changed? One of the biggest changes that we have President Donald Trump leaving the Paris Agreement, leaving the UNFCCC. And that has created a bit of leadership vacuum. My theory, what I see happening is China, which is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, but it's also the largest manufacturer of clean tech products like solar modules, wind turbines, electric vehicles, and batteries. China is actually going to play is going to be the leader, or is going to play more of a China will be at the forefront of some of the big negotiations at COP30. The other interesting thing is China and Brazil which are both part of BRICS, have been very much trying to play a stronger role in climate in the last few years. If you look at the recent BRICS meetings, which, as we know, also includes Russia, India, and South Africa, amongst other countries like Saudi Arabia, which are also joining in, climate has become a bigger role for them, because they also know that if they have cheaper energy and if they build out their renewables, from an economic sense, it's a growing market. So I do feel that China will play a bigger role. And also the other chasm we see at COP repeatedly is between the developed and the developing world, whether you want to call it the global south or the global north. And this is always central to negotiations. This is why there was a few countries left with a bitter taste in their mouth at Baku, because developing countries felt that not enough was pledged by developed countries. So we may see this divide, but with the US probably not going to play a big role at these negotiations. Technically, they're still part of COP. We did not see a US presence at the COP meetings in Bonn earlier this year in June. So the expectation is they will not be there. But one interesting thing, and I've heard this from quite a few people, as we know, recently in October, the US played a very big role in the failure of the International Maritime Organization in adopting,
of course,
a carbon price framework for the maritime sector. So it'll be interesting to see if the US, Trump's administration, if the US administration decides to turn up or not. But yes, I would say that China, EU, even the UK, EU and the UK in the last few years, obviously they've had to scale back some of their climate ambitions. But one thing that's sort of going for them is their targets, their sort of climate targets for net zero. They're pretty much on track. Now, some of it is the fact that the economic growth has stunted, which has helped reduce emissions, but also some of it is due to, as you mentioned, some of the policies from the previous administrations, which which drove some of that decarbonization.
Yeah, the geopolitics side of this, you really can't separate it from the business, the science. It's played such a big factor previously, but with the US administration, not necessarily being totally committed to some of the kind of historic goals of the COP process over time. I can see how any kind of leadership on this does need to come from, maybe it does come from the developing world, maybe it does come from China in this instance. So yeah, some very good points. I think we'll have to call it a day there. It's been a really fascinating discussion around what to expect from COP30. Thanks very much, Eklavya, for joining us. Thanks very much, Lindsey, joining us there from Brazil. If you want to download more episodes of the Look Forward podcast, check us out on Spotify, on the Apple Podcast Store, or on YouTube. You can also download episodes of the Energy Evolution podcast on a weekly basis, and the Sustainability podcast hosted by Lindsey. Thanks very much, both of you, for joining me on the show.